Good day, everyone. My name is Mike Ryan, and I'm the leader of the UBS Sustainability Impact Institute. Welcome to our agenda today. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the impact economy. First, we're going to bring in one of our senior fellows, Paul Donovan, who'll be talking about the recently released white paper and the findings that we have. And then secondly, I'm really looking forward to a moderated discussion with our key founding forum members, where we'll debate their perceptions of what an impact economy means and how we need to think differently about the future. Before we get going, though, I just wanted to share a few things about the Institute itself. The whole goal of the Institute is really to be in the cutting edge of thought leadership. It's to create a new dynamic in terms of how we think about having a dialogue about the sustainability and the impact space. Our vision is to create this ecosystem where we bring leadership together for impactful people and ideas, and we connect them. I think we also need to understand, of course, that the Institute is meant to be a place or a forum for debate and discussion. Again, it's bringing scholarship, it's bringing leadership in to foster those discussions. I want to pivot now for a moment for the impact economy and what this means. What we're faced with right now is a difference in terms of the way we perceive how we conceive value. We focused historically on production from the essentials. What is it that we measure progress in? First, it was the ability to have food for survival. Then as we evolved, it became the accumulation of certain types of goods. But we've now moved to a point where goods alone is not enough. The output economy is no longer relevant, or I should say sufficient for what we need going forward. So therefore, what we need to think about is what are the quality of life issues? And that's why we're directing this discussion around the impact economy. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to have our forum members engage in the conversation with us. Again, just to remind you, the forum was, we wanted to put together some of the most important subject matter experts and thought leaders in the fields of sustainability and impact. And we wanted to draw them from the ranks of academia, from the business community, public policy and officials, scientific community, those people who are actively engaged in the important discussions around both sustainability and impact. So with that as context, what I want to do now is I want to turn it over to Paul Donovan, who will go through the concept of the impact economy and introduce some of the key findings from our impact economy white paper. So Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mike. So what is the impact economy? Well, I think it's worthwhile going right back to the basics. And of course, the most basic question is, what are economists for? Well, obviously, a world without economists would be a pretty bleak place, but the reason economists exist is to solve the economic problem. And the economic problem is that we have limited resources in terms of natural resources, in terms of time, in terms of human skills, and we have unlimited wants and desires. And so what economists exist to do is to try and balance these things out and to allocate the resources we have available so as to best meet as many of the desires people have as possible. And that has been the whole objective of economics since the start of the profession. Now, as Mike has already mentioned, what has happened is that over time there has been an evolution of the wants and desires that people have. People's desires are not static over time. They change, they evolve. If you are in a situation of subsistence farming, your main overwhelming desire is to have enough food to survive. But as time goes on, we've evolved into the mercantile economy of trade, and then particularly after 1950 to the output economy, where in the aftermath of the devastation of the Second World War, there was a huge focus on acquiring things. We wanted to rebuild living standards by rebuilding material possessions, and then a little later on, also selected services. And that very much lent itself to the GDP metric, the concept of gross domestic product, which was really entrenched in 1950 as the standard of living measure. But the problem is, particularly in recent years, the wants and desires of humanity have changed. We have evolved again. And yes, we still want the smartphones, we still want the holidays, we still want the output economy, but we also want a future. We want a planet that is going to be sustainable over the medium term. We also want to be treated with respect, to have diverse and inclusive societies where there is equality of opportunity. And so what we have seen here is this evolution of desires, which we now, as economists, have to try and balance out. That, essentially, is the impact economy. We're not just focused on the output of GDP, we're focused on a far broader spectrum of needs and desires, and the question economists have to try and answer is how do we best meet those needs and desires? And actually, we have just recently had a very, very clear indication of the evolution of economic needs with the referendum in Switzerland recently, which voted with a majority, a sizable majority of the population, to move to zero environmental impact for the Swiss economy by 2050. The general population is saying, no, this is something that we desire to come from the economy. So economists are now trying to work out how best to meet these needs and desires. And I think one of the main challenges that we have got, one of the main obstacles as we move in this direction, is the measurement. Because there is a lot of disagreement, not just over what we are measuring in order to achieve environmental sustainability or diversity and inclusion, but also how we go about measuring this, because the very methodology is under question. One of the great advantages of GDP was its beguiling simplicity. It's a nice single number. Even politicians can grasp this and focus on the single number of GDP. But as we look at a more complicated world, and more complicated needs and desires, that single economic statistic is just not going to work. But there is so much disagreement and confusion about how we should be measuring the impact economy that at the moment that perhaps is hindering the progress towards that and the allocation of resources. Ultimately, over the course of the next years and decades, the private sector, the volunteer sector, the public sector need to come together and agree common measurement standards and then work separately and collectively to achieve those standards, to make sure that the modern wants and needs of the economic problem are going to be satisfied in the future generations that are striving towards a more evolved sense of where economics is going. Thank you, Mike.
Paul, thanks for that insightful view on the impact economy. It's now my honor, my privilege to introduce to you, who will be debating on this issue of the impact economy, the founding members of the UBS Sustainability Impact Institute, the forum. Let me start with introducing Sir Partha Dasgupta, who's the Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Cambridge. Now, he's done a broad research that's covered welfare and development economics and the economics of technological change. We also have with us Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. She's the Chief Scientist of the Nature Conservancy. She's the Endowed Chair Distinguished Professor at Texas Tech University, Red Raider Country. Katharine's a climate scientist whose research and outreach focuses on understanding the impacts of climate change and empowering people to be advocates for climate action. She's been named one of Time's 100 most influential people and United Nations Champion of the Earth. Third, we also have with us from the business community, we have Peter Bakker. Peter's the president and CEO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He leads the premier global CEO-led community of over 200 of the world's leading sustainability businesses, working collaboratively and collectively to accelerate the system transformation that's needed for a net zero world, for nature positive and more equitable future. And last but certainly not least, we have with us as well, Fiona Reynolds. She's the chair of the UN Global Compact Network Australia and the former CEO of the UN Principles and Responsible Investment from 2013 to 2022. During which time the organization's membership grew to over 5,000 firms and represented over 140 trillion in assets under management. So again, let me thank you all for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to have you with me. What we're going to do now is we're going to conduct a discussion following up on Paul's comments about the impact economy. So what I want to do is I'm going to direct questions that initially certain forum members are going to bring the whole group in. So the first thing is I want to have a brief discussion about what this impact economy means to us. Now, again, this is a term that's been thrown around pretty broadly. We heard Paul's perspective on it. What I'd like to do now is hear from you. So Katharine, if you can share with us what it is about the impact economy and what does it mean for you?
Thank you, Mike. So Paul mentioned that we have to expand the definition of what we consider the economy. And this is a challenge that has confronted those concerned about environmental issues for a long time, because our economy does not account for externalities. It assumes there is always infinite inputs and the outputs can go somewhere where we don't have to worry about them. Well, we don't live on an infinitely flat planet. We live on a round planet. And what that means is what goes in comes back out again and has to go back in. And because our economy, our economic system has not considered the externalities of pollution, biodiversity loss, and today the urgent crisis of climate, we have found ourselves in a place where, to quote the impact report, humans have been borrowing on the environmental credit card with no thought about how the bill would be paid, and that debt is now coming due. When we talk about what we call environmental issues, what we're really talking about is the future of human civilization as we know it. The planet will survive. The question is, what will our society look like? And that is the question at hand today, and the question that must be addressed by turning our economy into an impact economy that actually considers the true metrics of a thriving world.
Great. Thank you, Katharine. I appreciate that perspective. Peter, let me turn to you now from the business side. What does the impact economy look from your lens?
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for having me. We live in a world where the planetary boundaries have been crossed by the human wants and needs. So it's not just a matter of how do we adjust the world and the economy to those needs. We've actually overshot the capacity of the planet to carry all of us. And that means we need to really start measuring what is the impact that business has on climate, on biodiversity, but also on social equity for the people around us. And that means the impact economy for me is a world where we will think that the transformation that we're now going into is one at system level. This is no longer the business model where incrementally we try to improve. We have to fundamentally rethink the economic incentives, the business models, the technologies, the energy, the food we produce, i.e. everything will have to change. And the impact economy is going to provide us with the language and the incentives to steer us back within the planetary boundaries.
Great. Thank you, Peter. So Partha, both Katharine and Peter had talked about this notion about the economics of impact. What does it look to you like from an economic lens as you think about the impact economy?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very much in agreement with both Peter and Katharine. I'll reframe it in the language that you've asked me to, which is one of asset management. We should be thinking of everybody's life involves asset management, whether you're a fisherman, whether you're a trader, whether you're a householder, whether you're a business person, it's all asset management. And the assets that we have considered up to now, and particularly emphasized over the past 70 years, are produced capital, buildings and roads and machines and so forth, and human capital, health, education. And both are, of course, of the greatest importance, but we have neglected natural capital. That is, for ecosystems writ large, from the small to the large, and non-living material, and which we now call natural capital. So it's really a balancing act. And basically what we have done is to have underpriced, and I'm reframing the points that have already been made, but in my language, underpriced to the extent of some of them being even negative for natural capital. So of course, our portfolio management has gone completely awry. That's one way of looking at it. If an asset is zero price, you don't want to hold it because it doesn't give you any capital gains or any, but the return is too low. And one way of looking at the impact economy is to create the institutions where at the individual level, each one of us will find it in his or her interest to have the right balance amongst the assets that we have access to.
Great, thank you, Partha. Fiona, let me bring you into the conversation now. We've heard, certainly Paul talked about GDP, and it was also alluded to from Peter, Katharine, and Partha as well. So what is the biggest challenge in terms of moving beyond the current measure of GDP that's focused on an output economy? How do we need to think about this transition to a new metric?
Well, I think it's a really big a really big challenge. I mean, as we've heard from others, the impact economy in a simple form to me is one that balances people, profit, and planet, and it understands the interconnections between them. And GDP, as we've heard, has been our traditional monetary measure of goods and services that came into being in the aftermath of World War II. And at that time was probably the right measure. But what was right then doesn't mean that it's right now. And as we've talked about, the impact economy is really a different way of thinking from traditional economic theory that has had measuring GDP at its heart, and it's equated living standards with owning things and about how much is produced without giving regard to how efficiently it's made or how it's distributed or what's the long-term cost that may be incurred to the health of people and the planet. So I think the era of GDP as king has passed, and it probably passed its use by date a long time ago. But I think people are really reluctant to abandon, I think, as Paul said, the simplicity of a single number that purports to identify how good our lives are. But I'd say to those people that don't want to expand away from GDP as a measure, that we only really need to look around us. Current economic thinking has brought us runaway climate change, growing inequality, and we can't keep doing things in the same way and expect that we're going to get a different outcome. So we do really need to change the way we think about the economy. And I think, remember that the economy is part of our society, not the other way around. And that means GDP can't continue to be that measure. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a role. We just need to think about it far more holistically. But changing GDP and why it's difficult as that measure is because it represents a reset and a change in approach. It represents thinking in a whole different way. If I think about this from an investor perspective, investors, when they first started thinking about ESG issues, for example, used to think about the impact of ESG risks on their portfolio. Now they've evolved that thinking to think about, well, hang on a minute, what about my portfolio and what impact is that having on the real world? So while GDP, I think, has got a role to play, it doesn't mean that we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It can't alone be the measure that we need, but it's so embedded in our economies. It's in how countries look at their annual budget cycles, how they measure prosperity. It's how economists think. It's how they're taught. It sort of infiltrates everything we do. So change, I think, is coming, but change doesn't happen quickly. And, change sometimes takes too long to come about. But I think that there is definitely a recognition that we need to measure the things that matter in a far more effective and more holistic way.
Great, thank you, Fiona. You mentioned this need to change, and I think about now as we pivot from an output-based economy to an impact economy. And there's obviously going to be a role that's be played by financial institutions in a transition. So maybe what I'll do is I'll stay with you, Fiona, to start with. How do you see the role of financial institutions in that evolution that has to occur?
Well, financial institutions are vital. I mean, basically, at the end of the day, it's financial institutions who invest, and it's the way they invest that creates some of the issues that we're having. If you invest in a way that doesn't consider planetary boundaries, doesn't consider the cost of externalities, as Katharine was talking about, this is where we have significant problems. And so I think that investors are at the heart And bringing about change that we were just talking about GDP, for example, bringing about this change requires a whole of system approach. So we need the public sector to be working with the private sector and to be working with civil society. There isn't one sector that can do this alone. There isn't one organization. There isn't one government. The private sector and the public sector need to line up together about where we're going and all head in the right direction. And if I think about issues like climate change, I think that is where we're heading. We've finally got our head around the fact that climate affects all of us from a profitability point of view, as well as from the planet that we live on as individuals, and that we all need to be having the same agenda and moving together to bring about change, which is what we're going to have to do to bring about the impact economy.
Great, thanks, Bill. You know, you mentioned climate change, and let me bring you in, Katharine, because obviously it's right in your wheelhouse. From your seat as a climate scientist and your role in the Energy Conservancy, how do you perceive the role of financial institutions, and how can they help accelerate this transition?
Their role cannot be understated, in my opinion, because that is the investment that we're making in the future. And the challenge that lies before us is that we have to rethink the paradigm of how we've been investing successfully for decades and even centuries. So let me give you a very clear example. Last year, many of the largest oil and gas companies made their biggest profits ever. And so from that perspective, somebody might say, oh, well, this industry is doing very well, record profits, let's invest for the future. But we know as scientists that if we invest in continued dependence of oil and gas, locking in our addiction to fossil fuels for the next few decades, that ultimately could mean the end of our civilization as we know it. When we go back in time to the last period when the Earth million years ago, and even then it only warmed at 1/10 the rate that we humans are forcing it to warm today, many species couldn't keep up with that. And ultimately, it was even too hot for many humans to live in many parts of the world at that time. We are facing an unimaginable experiment that we're conducting with the only home we have, and there is no profit on a dead planet. So when we invest, we can't only afford to look at quarterly returns. We can't afford to look at annual returns. We have to realize that what is at stake here is our entire financial system, our entire economic system, our entire social and societal system. That's what's at stake. And we need to be making decisions that recognize that sometimes the best short-term option could absolutely be the worst long-term option. And that's a huge shift from the way that we have made these decisions in the past.
That's a great perspective, Katharine. Peter, let me bring you back to the conversation now, because Katharine just looked at this from the lens of a climatologist. You as a leader in the business community, how do you think about this? And again, any different perspective you may have on the role of financial institutions?
Yeah, I would say financial institutions have two important roles to play. One is make sure that capital flows to where the innovation is happening to make these transformations accelerate, i.e. make capital available and support the innovations. And the second big role is to understand the ESG performance of all assets and all companies in the world and rank them according to their sustainability performance integrated with their financial performance. Now, to the point that Katharine made, it is very hard to understand how oil and gas companies can get the premium they're getting today, that companies who in that space have been trying to invest in green are being punished in their PE ratios and are now leaving the green track to be a pure play oil and gas. While the climate scientists are telling us 6 years from now, the world will hit 1.5 degrees. This is an incredibly urgent matter. So what we need to do in the financial system is we need to start recognizing the environmental and the social risks that are associated with these type of investments. That will automatically lead to a different rating of what is a good and a bad asset class to invest in. And the second thing, as we do that, we need to then start directing the capital, the investments, into the solutions that have the biggest potential to head off these important challenges that are ahead of us. So the game in finance stays the same. The data points, i.e. environmental and social impacts, is what we now need to find a way to integrate in the investment decision tools.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Peter. Partha, one of the things that Peter mentioned is how we direct or how we channel capital. Now, I know your area of expertise has been developmental economics, right? So how do you think now about the role that's played and the importance in terms of how it transpires in development theory?
Well, thank you very much. Look, one of the things to emphasize is, from my point of view, is that everything that's been said so far by my colleagues is exactly right in my judgment. And I'll be reframing some of their points in the direction that you've asked me to. So take a representative company in the West, which has a long supply chain with primary products coming from, say, Africa or Latin America or South Asia, all right? And these are primary products, are the outputs of Mother Nature's goods coming from via ecosystems there, all right? We talked about externalities and effects of what happens to one ecosystem affects a neighboring ecosystem. So if there is an overshoot in the demand for the products of one ecosystem, then the neighboring ones get damaged and so forth, okay? Now, given the fact that many of these goods and services that nature offers us are unpriced, they're priced at zero, sometimes even negative. Of course, the importing company has very little incentives at the first reckoning in protecting the ecosystem from which the primary products are supplying the goods, which eventually end up in our supermarkets as a final product, okay? So here's a problem. We have an environmental risk, an ecosystem risk up the food supply chain, which is translating into risks for the profitability of the company. The company's records don't have depreciation of the assets on which its profits are built. And that brings us back to the extraordinary situation where oil and gas companies are making record profits because, of course, they don't have to take into account the depreciation their activities in inflicting on Mother Nature. So what does this particular company do? Well, one thing it could do is, if it worries about the fluctuations in its profits on account of the risk to the ecosystems from which it's drawing its primary products, would be to protect it. Now, protection will be half measured for the simple reason that the benefits are going to be spilling over to others as well. So this is one of those situations where, in some deep sense, it should be mandatory for companies now to disclose the way their entire supply chain is being managed, because disclosure would, in this language, would be a substitute for missing markets. The missing markets being markets for natural capital. And we've all been talking about the fact that we're overshooting our demand for Mother Nature's services and goods relative to her ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. That overshoot is now huge. And we mostly think of that overshoot in terms of climate change, that, in other words, are the emissions or concentration of carbon in the atmosphere relative to the biosphere's ability to recycle that. But of course, this is generally speaking for the whole class of natural capital assets, not just the atmosphere as a sink for our pollution. And so we really have to move away from climate change as an obsession to the entire biosphere as our support system. So it seems to me one of the things that really needs to be done is for companies now to realize that, in some sense, the era of intense competition should be seen as being over. You may compete, obviously, competition is very good, compete in the production side of things, but you really need to cooperate in managing those assets which are now unpriced, continue to be unpriced. One way of doing that is, in fact, to make that cooperation credible, is together to insist on governments to require of firms to make the disclosure, to be able to protect their supply chains, which are now correlated. The correlation means what? It means that the risks are correlated. That's the reason why cooperation is required. So I see the future of the impact, one of the characteristics of the impact economy, as being one in which we move away from the idea that in some sense there's a direct conflict between state regulation and private incentives, company incentives, to one in which there is a recognition that we need a great deal more cooperation between governments and the private sector, householders, in such a way that the incentives we all have to get on with our lives includes the impact we have on Mother Nature, because that's in some sense the priority now. Our overshoot on nature's goods and services is so large that never mind all else, we really need to close the gap between the two. Currently, the language in which we talk about the overshoot is in terms of climate, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and so forth. In other words, the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. We really need to move to all the assets that Mother Nature has on offer, which means ecosystems, mangroves, coral reefs, wetlands, grasslands, and not to mention, of course, the tropical rainforests. It's a huge enterprise here, but it can be done. And there's a great number of us who have actually written on it to show how we really need to rethink of the place of the householder, the community, the village, the region, the nation, and the international community of nations. Each of these centers has a strong role to play, and the time has come really that we move away from the notion of competition everywhere to one in which competition is embedded within a system of general cooperation.
Great, thank you, Partha. I think one of the things that Partha just hit on was this notion about what happens at the household level, how we need to think about this. And obviously, as individuals, we tend to be fearful or apprehensive about the future. But as we think about this transition to an impact economy, what are both the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead of us? Let me start with you first, Peter. What's your perspective on both the challenges and the opportunities going forward in an impact economy?
No, I think we're entering an era which is going to be the biggest innovation era that we've ever seen. We have to really rethink everything. The transport choices we make, the houses, the buildings, the offices we work in, the food and the way the food is produced needs to change. The energy we use needs to change. We'll see a massive amount of change, both at the household, personal level, but certainly from a business point of view, an innovation opportunity that we have not seen before. So anytime you talk about planetary boundaries and overshoot or climate change, you're always on the edge of turning people off and make them rather depressed. But I actually think this is an era of hope, of change, of speed of change that we haven't seen before. But, and that's why the conversation today is so important, that change and the speed of that change will not unfold if we do not provide the economic incentives to all actors, individuals, companies, but also governments, to really make those changes now really come alive and scale up fast.
Great, thanks, Peter. Katharine, let me ask you for the same question. Your opportunities and challenges, again, from your perch as a climate scientist, what do you see as again, both the opportunities and the pitfalls we have ahead of us?
Well, Mike, you mentioned that many people are fearful of the future. And when we look at the vast majority of messages about climate change, about biodiversity loss, about exceeding our planetary boundaries, they are crafted to induce fear. And now we've reached a point where the vast majority of people around the world are worried about these issues. They are aware of them and they're worried, but they don't know what to do. Because there's an extra layer of fear that's been added to that, and that is the fact that all too frequently, the solutions to these crises are painted in terms of loss. You have to stop doing that. You can't do that anymore. You can't have that anymore. They're painted in terms of corporate loss. There's all these extra things you have to do that are going to cost more money and cut into your profits, and you can't do business the way you used to. But even more seriously, I believe they're painted in terms of individual loss. You can't eat that, you can't drive that, you can't go there, you can't have children. And our human brain is literally wired to be more fearful of avoiding loss than excited about potential gain. And so what we see is this paralysis loop where the more worried we get, the more extreme the solutions are proposed, the more loss we fear, the more paralyzed we are. How do we exit from that loop? Well, that's exactly what Peter was alluding to. We have to talk about how the fact that these solutions we're talking about, this impact economy we're talking about, it will lead us to a better future, not a worse one. It will lead us to one where the air is cleaner to breathe and we don't have 10 million people a year dying from breathing in the fumes and particulates from fossil fuel emissions. It will lead us to a world where water is cleaner and more abundant, where food is available to all, where we're not wasting half the food we produce in high-income countries, while people in our own cities go hungry, let alone what's happening on the other side of the world. We will be living somewhere where it is healthier to live, not only in terms of the air and water and food, but we will be able to walk places instead of being bound to our vehicles and our transportation. Communities where people can engage with each other instead of being isolated from each other. We truly can reach that better world, and the solutions to the crises that we confront today, the climate, the biodiversity, and the pollution crises, these solutions will give us that better world, and that is what we're missing. And so to me, it was very impactful when Christiana Figueres, after shepherding the world to the Paris Agreement in 2015, then wrote a book called The Future We Choose. And in that book, yes, she includes the apocalyptic scenarios that climate scientists paint of what will happen if we don't do anything. But fully half of what she wrote paints a picture of what our lives would look like if we tackled this issue. All of the positive beneficial changes. And once we see that, that is what we need to run towards, because the other way that our brains are wired is our brains are wired to move forward towards something positive. We are only wired to run away quickly. You know, our adrenaline kicks in and we run away from the bear. But long-term fear and dread and worry, which is what these crises induce, paralyze us. That is the way we are wired. So if we do not share that vision of a better future, there is nothing for people to move forward towards. And so when we paint that picture, when we tell that story, when we share the incredible new technologies and opportunities we have, when we talk about how they will make businesses more efficient, how they can actually increase profits, how they can make our lives better, how they can ensure that sustainable future, that is the impetus that people need to break that paralysis loop. So fear is a huge part of the problem that we're confronting today, but I truly believe that we have in our hands the ways to overcome that fear.
Great, thank you. That's terrific perspective, Katharine. Fiona, let me actually give you the last word on this subject. We've heard sort of what we need to think about from the individual level, from the institutional level. You've done a lot of work with the UN, and how do you think about challenges and opportunities from the transnational level in terms of the international community?
Well, as I said, I think that this takes a whole of sector approach, and we do need all of the multilateral organisations showing leadership, and I think importantly, bringing together a lot of the different players. So in the period that I have worked within the investment community and working with in a UN supported organisation, if I use an example, one of the important roles that it has played is bringing the sector together to talk about the issues and to make commitments and then holding them to account for those commitments. That it's done lots of, the UN and other organisations have done lots of good research and continued to talk about the problem in a very global and holistic way. So I think it's vital that multilateral institutions are there to play a leadership role. If I come back to, I wanted to pick up on something just quickly though, on the investment community on finance. I think one of the other important roles that investors play is that they are shareholders of major corporations. They are the owners of those corporations. So they are able to have engagement with those companies about their expectations. They can decide to withdraw capital from those companies if those companies do not react in the way that they think they do, that they think they should. And I think the other thing is that investors have traditionally, when I started working in the finance community, investors really thought very, very short term. My fiduciary duty is to think about the returns that I give to members, and I have to think about daily pricing, quarterly returns, annual returns. But I've worked within the pension fund sector. And if I'm managing money for a young person today who, say, getting their first job and they're 25, they're not going to have their pension for 50, 60 years, and then they've got to keep living. So the idea that you wouldn't sort of think about these issues and think about that person, not just in a quarterly returns or an annual returns, but the world into which those people are going to retire, the world that they live in. And you don't think about what is the impact of my investments in the long term? What do I need to invest in for the long term? That just makes no sense. And so I think we are having a lot more joined up conversation. And coming back to the multilateral organizations, I do think that they help shed lights on these issues. And I do think that they have a way in that other organizations don't, to bring together governments, civil society, to bring them together with business, with investors, with bankers, to really focus on solutions. And that's an extremely powerful and important role. And I've seen it used really effectively throughout the UN system, I think particularly on the focus on climate change and on social issues.
Great, thanks, man. One thing I did hear current throughout all these discussions was system thinking here. And I think that's going to be an essential part of however we tackle this problem. If we try and isolate this and compartmentalize the problem, it becomes really difficult. But if we think about this in a holistic way, I think our ability to tackle it, certainly the need to tackle it, becomes more obvious. I'm going to close the discussion now. And I always enjoy doing this. I'm going to give you each about 15 seconds. It's a lightning round. And I'm going to ask you, from your perspective, what are you most hopeful about as you look forward for the impact economy? Katharine, let me start with you.
Well, as a climate scientist, the number one question I am asked is, what gives you hope? Or alternatively, sometimes, are we screwed? And for me, it's not the science that gives me a lot of hope, but it's recognizing that all around the world, this giant boulder of action is not sitting at the bottom of a cliff with only a few hands on it. It is already at the top of the hill, and it's rolling down the hill in the right direction, and it has millions of hands already on it. And if we add ours, and if we encourage those around us to add theirs, it will go faster. So people and action are what give me hope.
Great, thank you. Fiona?
Well, I feel like we've lived in a world when I've grown up where the economy always comes first. And we think about the economy and people and the planet come second. And I want to live in a world, and this is where I think we are heading and gives me hope, where society comes first and the economy is there to deliver on the things that we as a society want. And that's its role. And that we're going to think in a much longer term, intergenerational way, not just think about the economy for this year's budget, but think about it for future generations to come, and the world that we want to live, that we want to leave for them, that we want to live in, but we want to leave for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. And I don't think we're going to have things taken away from us. We're just going to do things differently. And I think it's fantastically exciting, and there's going to be so many opportunities. And I want to leave the world knowing that it's a better world than the one that I came into. And I think I will.
Great, thank you, Fiona. Peter, your perspective?
Well, the fact that an organization like UBS puts out an important paper on the impact economy gives me hope. Because if we can change the economic incentives that we give to business, that we put into the economic system, then finally we will unlock the acceleration of the transformation that we all need.
Great, thank you, Peter. Partha, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
Well, thank you very much. I think what gives me hope is the fact that we are increasingly recognizing a connection between our private aspirations and the private insults we feel that we are imposing on nature. We can see it happening or feel it happening with the scientific language that is there for us to make that connection. I think we overlook the enormous gains we have made over the past 60, 70 years in our understanding of how nature works at a deep level. And that knowledge, I mean ecology and the earth sciences more broadly speaking, that knowledge is now filtering into our educational syllabuses, and thereby enabling us to be able to make our connection between what we feel at the individual level is going wrong with our lives and an understanding of why that might be the case. That gives me hope.
Great, thank you, Partha. So first of all, thanks all of you for an incredibly insightful discussion. Peter, Partha, Fiona, Katharine, thanks so much for joining me. And again, it's so great to have you as forum members.